In 2024, within months of one another, two presidential re-elections took place that severely shook Venezuela. The first election, held in July, was the much-criticized domestic presidential contest in which Nicolas Maduro secured a third consecutive term. While elections described as neither free nor fair have long been the norm in Venezuela, there was still hope that, given the consistent spotlight, heavy external pressure, and the country's well-documented impoverishment, opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez might have clinched the office. However, that wasn't realized, was it? The second re-election came as somewhat of a bigger surprise. When Donald Trump delivered a commanding victory to secure a second term as US president, he brought with him a series of policy changes that reshaped not only the political landscape of the United States, but also much of the rest of the world. Perhaps due to the notoriety of some of these changes, such as cutting US aid support and hesitating to back Ukraine, a major development in Washington's relations with Caracas ended up receiving far less attention than it might have otherwise. Well, on February the 26th, 2025, Trump announced on his Truth Social platform, "We are hereby reversing the concessions that crooked Joe Biden gave to Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela on the oil transaction agreement dated November 26th, 2022. The potential consequences of this move are likely to be significant, and for Venezuela, the impact could simply be devastating." Even after his so-called successful re-election, 2024 proved no joyride for Nicolas Maduro, the former bus driver who was groomed for leadership by ex-President Hugo Chavez. For years, Maduro had weathered cyclical protests against his regime, and 2024 was no exception. Following a contentious election, massive protests once again erupted in Venezuelan cities. These protests raged for 2 months, resulting in dozens of deaths before finally being quelled. But the headache for Maduro didn't stop with domestic unrest. Protests broke out abroad, while countries such as the US and Canada targeted members of his administration with a fresh round of sanctions. In August, the hacker group Anonymous declared cyber war against the Venezuelan government and reportedly hacked 325 government sites, including the official websites of the presidency and the CICPC, Venezuela's main criminal investigation agency. Before the election, Maduro issued bold statements threatening to annex the western half of neighboring Guyana, the Essequibo region. In early 2024, Venezuela began amassing troops along the border. However, faced with overwhelming international condemnation and threats from the United States to intervene, Venezuela appeared to back down. Although Maduro's saber-rattling over Guyana may have been a clumsy attempt to distract from the country's many problems, the idea of reintegrating Essequibo remains a popular domestic theme. Many see the region as having been unfairly stripped from Venezuelan control in 1899. Yet with the United States backing Guyana, Maduro's self-important promises to play the role of the great liberator embarrassingly fell short. He soon reverted to provocative incursions and statements denouncing Guyana's government as fascist and describing its oil extraction as illegal. As if that were not enough, before the year was out, Maduro saw one of his few key allies, Syria's Bashar al-Assad, toppled and exiled by a lightning rebel ouster. He also witnessed the strength of two other crucial allies come into serious question: Russia's faltering performance in its war in Ukraine and Iran's near collapse of its proxies in Syria and Lebanon, compounded by the ignominy of Israel assassinating Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh on its own soil. There wasn't much good news, but there was some. Venezuela, long considered a petro-state almost uniquely reliant on its oil for survival, actually saw an increase in its oil exports in 2024. In January, Reuters reported that Venezuela's exports rose by more than 10% compared to the previous year, a symbolic victory for Maduro and a crucial bit of respite for a country beleaguered by the growing success of its competitors and even its direct neighbors in Colombia and Guyana. The increase was attributed to Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, taking on more cargoes under licenses granted by Washington through President Joe Biden in 2022. But only 3 days after announcing increased exports, Donald Trump returned to the White House, and the promising news for Venezuela wasn't going to last very long. The next month, Trump declared that the Biden-era licenses would vanish, an announcement that could bring a world of hurt for Venezuela. News coverage isn't just about what you hear, it's about how you hear it. Take this recent headline. CIA director says US has paused intelligence support to Ukraine. And that seems like pretty straightforward stuff, right? But depending on where you read this, the narrative shifts a lot. Some outlets frame it as a necessary pause, signaling a recalibration in US-Ukraine relations. Others paint it as an abandonment, fueling concerns that Ukraine is being left out to dry. Meanwhile, some reports focus on the potential impact on Ukraine's military strategy and battlefield intelligence. It's the same event, but it's got completely different takeaways. That's why I use today's sponsor, Ground News. It doesn't just show me one version of the story, it compares coverage across left, across center, and right-leaning outlets, so you can see the full picture. Their bias rating reveals how different sides spin the same event, and their blind spot feed shows you stories that one side of the media is just completely ignoring. If you want to actually understand what's happening in the world, not just what one outlet wants you to believe, Ground News is absolutely a must-have. So, go to ground.news/WarFronts to instantly access local perspectives on global issues. Right now, you can get 40% off their Unlimited Vantage plan and start seeing the bigger picture today. Ground News, because knowing what's happening isn't enough. You need to know how it's being told. And now back to today's video. Although Nicolas Maduro might claim otherwise, revoking the licenses and thereby ending America's purchase of Venezuelan oil is likely to prove critical for Caracas. As you may know, Venezuela boasts immense oil reserves. According to OPEC data, the country holds proven reserves of around 303 billion barrels, which unmistakably makes it the nation with the most oil in the world and places it significantly ahead of Saudi Arabia's 260 billion barrels. However, this abundance does not necessarily mean the oil is of the highest quality. You see, although Venezuela has vast reserves, it is the quality of its oil that deters investors. Oil is typically evaluated based on its lightness and purity, two factors that play a significant role in both its extractability and its overall fitness for use. Generally, lighter oil is easier to extract than heavy oil, and one common measure used to assess crude oil weight is the American Petroleum Institute's, or API's, gravity index. In short, if a liquid's API gravity is greater than 10, it is light enough to float on water. If it's less than 10, it's heavy and it sinks. High API oil is more desirable because it's easier to move from the reservoir to the producing well. According to McKinsey, Venezuelan crude oil has an API ranging between 16 and 30, making it relatively heavy. By contrast, though, Saudi oil typically ranges from 28 to 51. Consequently, Venezuelan oil demands a much more intensive process for both extraction and refinement. It requires specialized expertise as well as unfettered access to the reservoir, advantages that vanished when Venezuela, under Chavez and later Maduro, set to drive American interests out in the 2000s. Moreover, its oil contains many impurities, the most common being sulfur, a corrosive element that can damage producing wells. The elevated sulfur content not only makes refining more challenging, but also places Venezuelan crude at the forefront of becoming a so-called stranded asset. In an industrial transition, particularly one moving toward greener forms of energy, this type of product is increasingly deemed undesirable. So, Venezuelan oil is not top quality, and with the recent proliferation of sources, America has plenty of alternative suppliers for its energy needs. In addition to its chief partners in Canada and Mexico, the US has countries like Brazil, Colombia, Iraq, and now Guyana waiting in the wings to boost supply if needed, all on top of its own expanding domestic oil production. Oil was once thought to be a scarce resource, but that notion is fading as new oil discoveries, such as those in Guyana, emerge with increasing regularity. Even Iran, one of Venezuela's few remaining allies and a country that might otherwise have been tempted to buy its oil, uncovered oil reserves comparable in size to Guyana's in 2017. Given the vast array of potential suppliers, and barring extenuating circumstances like the Arab oil embargo of the 1980s, the US does not really need to compromise on quality by accepting subpar Venezuelan crude. Even so, the US, in a different context, may have acted similarly. The Trump administration is renowned for its protectionism, willing to compromise on product quality to boost favored industries, particularly those based in the US or in allied countries. Had the US and Venezuela been allies, Washington might have been tempted to continue buying Caracas's products. However, US relations with Venezuela have been strained even at the best of times, and in light of the two most recent elections, now they're pretty much abysmal. Donald Trump has been a cogent and consistent critic of both Venezuela's leadership and its oil. In his characteristically hyperbolic fashion, he once labeled Venezuelan crude as tar and deemed it the, quote, dirtiest oil in the world in 2023. When Maduro orchestrated his unceremonious state recapture in July 2024, Trump, elected just a few months later, seized the opportunity to rescind any remaining oil agreements with Venezuela. These agreements, while dispensable for the US, have proved crucial for Venezuela's fragile economy. To understand why Venezuela is so utterly reliant on its oil exports, it is important to recall not only what the country once was, but also what it's since become. After oil was discovered in Venezuela in 1914, successive governments capitalized on the country's vast reserves and the rising global demand, making both the nation and some of its leaders really, really wealthy. By the 1950s, Venezuela ranked as the fourth richest country in the world in GDP per capita, trailing only behind the United States, Switzerland, and New Zealand. However, Venezuela quickly evolved into a condition that would eventually contribute to its undoing. It became a rentier state, a state deriving all or most of its revenue from rent paid by foreign individuals, corporations, or governments. Simultaneously, it transformed into a petrostate, one of the most notorious examples in history, with the majority of its revenue dominated by oil production. So, a petrostate is generally defined as a country that derives more than 10% of its GDP from oil. However, by 2024, Venezuela depended on oil for roughly 60% of its annual budget and more than 95% of the total value of all of its exports. While these oil exports may have enabled the state to thrive in the mid-20th century when Europe, devastated by conflict, urgently needed the resource and few suppliers were available, they also meant that Venezuela's fortunes became directly tied to the highly volatile oil market, as most of you probably know. Moreover, Hugo Chávez's presidency in the early 2000s had a massively negative impact on Venezuelan oil exports. In 2002, when employees of the state-run oil company PDVSA went on strike, Chávez responded by firing more than 19,000 workers, a decision that severely limited Venezuela's oil production and in turn caused its export volumes to plummet. Venezuela's oil export surged in the 1990s and relied heavily on American contractors and their expertise in extracting and refining its imperfect crude. However, Chávez compounded the problem by targeting so-called capitalist and neoliberal entities, which he claimed were taking advantage of Venezuela. As a result, Venezuela was left without both the expertise and manpower needed to fully exploit its oil resources. Worse still, Chávez's socialist-infused nationalization measures led to the collapse of many private businesses and industries, further choking the economy and deepening its dependence on oil exports. Public debt rose dramatically, and by 2013, the year Chávez died and Maduro was handpicked to replace him, Venezuela teetered on the edge, with even a slight plunge in oil prices threatening collapse. And that is exactly what happens a year later, when the 2014 oil price drop pushed the country over the edge. The years since have been nothing short of apocalyptic for Venezuela. However, some reprieve was offered by the US in 2022. Under President Joe Biden, the US Department of Treasury issued Venezuela General License 41. This license allowed Chevron Corporation, the second largest oil company by revenue in the US, to resume limited natural resource extraction operations in Venezuela. Venezuelan oil exports, which had nearly vanished during the tail end of Donald Trump's first presidency, began to rise once more. By 2024, imports from Venezuela had increased to 228,000 barrels per day, making it the US's fourth largest supplier after Canada, Mexico, and Saudi Arabia. This was something like a lifeline for Venezuela, a country whose oil production capacity had nosedived from 3.4 million barrels per day in 1998, the year before Chávez took office, to 2.32 million the year he died, and further down to 786,000 by late 2023. This decline, when combined with the rise of other oil-exporting nations during the intervening years, the fall-off of other Venezuelan industries, and the sharp population increase from 23 million in 1998 to 30 million in 2014, has made an already constrained government budget even more strained. In short, Trump's election and his somewhat unsurprising announcement, given his record on Venezuela, could not have come at a worse time for Maduro. On one hand, Venezuela's economy is in one of its worst states ever. In 2024, Venezuela's GDP hovered around $113 billion, having remained stagnant for the past 4 years, a stark fall from a peak of $371 billion in 2013. On the other hand, the oil market remains relatively strong and stable, with the United States still being the world's second biggest buyer after China. Notably, Venezuela's entire GDP in 2024 was $113 billion, only marginally higher than the value of US oil imports from Canada alone, which stood at roughly $103 billion for the same year. Around the time of Maduro's last election in 2018, global crude prices were low and volatile, oscillating between $40 and $55 per barrel, even though they briefly peaked at $73 during the summer of his election. Not long after, the oil price tumbled again all the way down to $18, and it remained largely under $50 throughout the disastrous first 3 years of his second term. Then In 2022, the price of oil surged to $113 per barrel, and it was shortly after this spike that Joe Biden granted Chevron a license to operate joint ventures with Venezuela in a bid to encourage the Maduro government to allow free and fair elections. The sole condition under the arrangement was that the US company was barred from paying, quote, any taxes or royalties to the government of Venezuela. Now, this deal undoubtedly came as a huge boon for Venezuela, given its economic woes and its singular reliance on oil to stay afloat. Although the price of oil later fell significantly, costing the state billions, it has remained relatively stable in the years since, declining incrementally from around $80 in 2022 to roughly $67 today. But Trump's move may wipe all of that out once again. Even if his successor in the US government were to reverse the decision, Venezuela might not have the luxury of waiting. You see, there's another major challenge looming on the horizon: the green transition. So the green transition, it poses a significant threat not just to Venezuela, but also to other oil-producing nations and petrostates such as Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Qatar. In short, while oil and gas consumption is expected to remain strong for most of the next decade and may even peak by 2030, a dramatic decline is projected beyond that point. Western nations have long aimed to transition toward decarbonization and a reduction in fossil fuel use. According to the International Energy Agency, if these goals are met, oil and gas consumption could fall by more than 75% by 2050. In essence, oil could become obsolete in just a few years. If Venezuela fails to offload as much of its gargantuan reserves as possible before 2030, it will be left with the world's largest stockpile of a once valuable resource that is now largely unwanted, and it will miss out on hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue, funds that could develop new industries and help stabilize its struggling economy. With Trump and his virulent stance on Venezuela set to continue until 2029, the country risks losing the precious few remaining years of profitability before the full consequences of the green transition take hold. That's long been argued that any decline in oil use would be especially devastating for Venezuela, with a study by the US Institute for Peace identifying it as one of the most vulnerable countries in such a scenario. Unlike petrostates like Saudi Arabia, Venezuela has taken no significant steps to address its heavy dependence on oil. While the kingdom and other Gulf states have sought to reinvest their oil reserves and diversify their economies through tourism, sports, and various other, sometimes rather tacky initiatives, Venezuela has not pursued any comparable strategy. Its tourism and manufacturing sectors are struggling, and despite its vast size, the country is not even self-sufficient in agriculture, relying significantly on food imports, a third of which come from none other than the United States. Worse still, Venezuela lacks substantial allies in the region, counting only small countries like Nicaragua and Cuba among its limited partners, and it has no dependable sources of aid should its economy decline further, at least not without a swift and dramatic political shift. Now, all of this was something that Venezuela would have sought to remedy quickly by absorbing the Essequibo and selling off its oil, thereby offsetting the inevitable collapse looming on the horizon. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the oil discovered by American company ExxonMobil on the seafloor of the Essequibo region in 2015, while not as abundant as Venezuela's reserves, turned out to be of a far higher quality. It has a high API, which means it's very light, and a low sulfur content, making it inexpensive to produce. Guyana has long been embroiled in a dispute with Venezuela over that portion of its territory, with Venezuela laying claim to the region since both countries gained independence. This conflict gained renewed urgency when Guyana's oil reserves were uncovered. Even while still under the Biden administration, the US made it quite clear that it would not tolerate any interference from Venezuela in Guyana's newfound bounty, particularly as it is likely to end up in Americans' hands at a tidy price. And if Biden was unwilling to entertain Venezuelan irredentist notions, then the likelihood under Trump seems little more than a fantasy, doesn't it? Now, even if Trump had not made his damning announcement, Venezuela was already in a precarious position because of its tainted supply of black gold. Trump's characterization of Venezuelan oil as the dirtiest in the world might have come off as another example of his signature exaggeration, yet a very similar assessment was offered by Valerie Marcel, an energy expert at Chatham House, during an interview with the Financial Post in 2020. Marcel and other experts further predicted that the appeal of Venezuelan oil would soon wane due to its impurity, leading fewer and fewer companies to consider investing in Venezuela as the green transition took hold. The most common type of oil found in Venezuela is the so-called Orinoco Belt crude, renowned for both its massive abundance and for being one of the world's most carbon-intensive oil variants, traits that render it fairly unattractive to energy producers. With that said, there were measures the Venezuelan government could have taken to change its oil's appeal. Ricardo Hausmann, the former Venezuelan planning minister, noted that extracting Venezuelan oil came with almost zero geological risk, and perhaps even more importantly, very low production costs. Hausmann added that if Venezuela were not burdened by its domestic challenges and its anti-American, anti-capitalist stance, it could have created an investment-friendly environment attractive to US investors. The low production cost of Orinoco Belt crude might prove particularly significant, as the break announced by Trump could work against the interests of not only Venezuela, but also of Chevron itself. You see, Chevron Corporation announced in February that it would lay off up to 20% of its global staff by the end of 2026 in an effort to cut costs. Employees were informed that the company had been falling behind competitors and struggling to make decisions quickly enough. Despite the high volume of Venezuelan oil exported to the US under the Biden licenses, the state could almost certainly forego this supply, especially with an ever-growing queue of willing suppliers. However, individual companies might not have that same luxury. Access to inexpensive Venezuelan labor might have been exactly what saved Chevron from further uncertainty. In light of Donald Trump's focus on protecting US corporate interests, this situation may come to represent a sort of double jeopardy. Setting Chevron's fate aside, the cost of Venezuela could be unmatched. Had Venezuela been able to offer a state that functioned effectively, provided relative security, and maintained an investment-friendly tax formula, it might still have had a chance to attract oil companies. Instead, Venezuela has achieved none of these, and its future may soon become even more precarious. And the falling oil price, from a high of $131 per barrel in 2022 to $67 today, signals another potential danger: a new oil glut. An oil glut occurs when there's an oversupply of oil on the market, a situation that can ruin oil-producing countries as their revenues may plunge by billions. Now, that may be great news for oil consumers, but it is crippling for suppliers. In this respect, companies like Chevron may share their woes with Venezuela, a country that could face not only an oversupply of a product with a vanishing shelf life, but also very few willing buyers to stave off its economic turmoil. With Iran producing its own oil and Russia busy with its war in Ukraine while also producing oil, the walls may quickly close in further on Venezuela. The country's last hope to salvage its flailing economy may lie with China, which has now become its single largest customer. But China has proven to be a fickle friend even at the best of times. With all its hopes pinned on a single customer, and in a world where oil is no longer regarded as an exclusively enduring resource, who can really say what the future holds for the troubled Bolivarian Republic? Thank you for watching.